President Trump locked eyes with Chairman Xi inside the suffocating Hall of Supreme Harmony, ready to drop a brutal reality check that would shatter the globalist narrative to pieces. Chairman Xi, do you know what the supreme leader of Iran and an overcooked piece of fried chicken have in common? The question hung in the air, heavy and sharp, slicing right through the dead silence of the room. It wasn't the kind of opening line you'd ever find in a State Department briefing binder. It wasn't the sanitized, focus group-tested garbage that the Washington establishment had been spoon-feeding the American public for decades. This was raw. This was a calculated bombshell dropped high above the sprawling courtyards of the Forbidden City. The afternoon sun was bleeding out, casting a fake golden glow over the ancient, curved roofs, trying to project a warmth that simply didn't exist in this room. Down below, past the heavy wooden doors, the state-run media cameras were locked in place. They were filming what they thought would be a standard, predictable summit. They were expecting a polite swap of diplomatic sweet talk, a photo op set up to calm the nervous markets. They were expecting the American president to play by the unwritten, cowardly rules of globalist etiquette. But up here on the private balcony, stripped of the handlers and the yes-men, the vibe was as cold and unforgiving as a max security interrogation room. The only sound trying to fill the void was the quiet, steady dripping of high-grade tea being poured into a porcelain cup. Drip, drip, drip. Every drop felt loud enough to shatter glass. A sharp observer, someone not blinded by the mainstream media's endless brainwashing, would instantly spot the stark contrast between the two men sitting across the narrow wooden table. On one side sat the American president, wearing his trademark navy blue suit. It was a suit that screamed undeniable economic muscle, unapologetic capitalism, and the kind of raw, get-it-done power that built the modern world. He sat, leaning slightly forward, loose but predatory. He was the living, breathing picture of a country that was finally done apologizing for being great. Across from him sat the chairman. He was buttoned up tight in a traditional dark Mao suit, an outfit carefully designed to project unity, continuity, and the quiet, creeping takeover of a regime that had spent years buying up the world. They had been buying up the world while America's political class looked the other way, too busy lining their own pockets to notice the threat right in front of them. Right now, though, the chairman wasn't moving a muscle. His face was a masterclass in holding a poker face, looking like a stone monument that had weathered centuries of storms. But behind those narrow, unblinking eyes, his brain was working in overdrive. Silence was the only weapon the host had left. It was a trick that had worked perfectly against the weak, pushover politicians of the past. The globalist elites, the career swamp bureaucrats, would usually trip over themselves to fill a dead silence like this. They'd be terrified of rubbing him the wrong way, eager to offer up a compromise just to keep the chat going and protect their precious international norms. But Donald Trump didn't flinch. He let the silence drag out. He let it wrap around the chairman's neck like a tightening wire. He wasn't in any rush. The president leaned back just a bit, the corners of his mouth twitching up into a knowing, dangerous smirk. They are both done. The words dropped like a hammer on an anvil. And nobody can swallow something that burnt. He didn't wait for a translator to soften the blow. He didn't wait for a spooked diplomat to dress it up into something easier for the international press corps to stomach. He looked dead into the eyes of the man who had bankrolled the very enemies America was currently tearing apart. And that, Mr. Chairman, is exactly what happens when you try to blackmail the United States of America with a pile of garbage missiles. There it was, the undeniable truth that the left-wing media machines back in New York and Washington had been desperately trying to bury for months. The talking heads on the legacy networks had been spinning a non-stop storyline of fear. They told the American people that standing up to Tehran would kick off World War III. They warned that putting America first would leave us isolated, that showing strength was somehow a moral failure. They wanted the public to buy into the idea that the Iranian regime was this massive, terrifying force. They wanted you to believe that the only way out was to buy them off with pallets of untraceable cash and disastrous, one-sided nuclear deals. But sitting on that balcony, thousands of miles away from the treacherous Beltway, the president was tearing down the illusion. He was exposing the hollow core of the enemy, and he was doing it right to the face of their biggest global sugar daddy. The chairman finally moved his hands, slowly reaching for his teacup in a deliberate, tightly controlled move meant to hide the shock of the direct hit. You have a very unconventional way of opening a dialogue, Mr. President. His voice was smooth, carrying the heavy weight of an ancient empire, but there was a clear edge of tension right beneath the surface, a tiny crack in the porcelain mask. Unconventional. The president let out a low, raspy chuckle that had absolutely no warmth in it. I call it cutting through the BS. We can sit here and talk about bilateral teamwork and mutual respect until the sun comes up tomorrow. We can smile for the cameras and pretend everything's peachy. But you and I both know why we're really sitting at this table. You thought your buddies in the Middle East had us boxed in. You thought they could stack up a massive pile of ballistic and cruise missiles, hide them in caves, and use them as a shield. The game plan was simple, wasn't it? They were going to crank out cheap drones, ramp up their military factories, and then turn around and face the rest of the world. They were going to look at us, look at Israel, and announce they were booting their nuclear weapons program back up. They thought they could threaten to blow up the entire region. They thought they could threaten to drop warheads on London, Paris, and Berlin if we dared to get in their way. The president leaned forward again, tapping a single, hard finger on the wooden table. But they did the math wrong. And frankly, Chairman, so did you, if you thought I was going to let that happen on my watch. Think about what the deep state wanted in this exact scenario. They wanted endless, dragging negotiations. They wanted to give power to globalist clubs like the UN to write strongly worded letters while our enemies armed themselves to the teeth. They hated this president, not because he was rough around the edges, but because he refused to play their rigged game. He refused to pretend the emperor had clothes on. He bypassed their entire corrupt system. And right now, he was proving exactly why he had to. The supreme leader is gone, the president kept going, his voice dropping an octave, carrying the rock-solid certainty of a guy who held all the cards and knew exactly how to play them. And, the network that backed up his little extortion racket, it's currently sitting in smoking ruins. The chairman took a slow sip of his tea, his eyes never leaving the president. He was looking for a crack in the armor. He was looking for a bluff, a hint of that typical Western insecurity he was so used to preying on when dealing with past administrations. He found absolutely nothing. The world is a very complicated place, President Trump. Power isn't always measured by what you blow up. Sometimes it's measured by what you build, and who you build it with. It was a classic, calculated dodge. It was a pivot to the long game, an attempt to steer the chat back into the safe zone of diplomatic double talk. But the president was an absolute master at controlling the pace of the room. He wasn't going to let the chairman hide behind philosophical riddles. He was going to nail him to the wall with cold, hard facts. Let me tell you about what is being built right now in Iran. Absolutely nothing. Because you can't build a damn thing when your entire society is in a total, unrecoverable freefall. The president let the heavy reality of the situation hang in the air. He was forcing the chairman to face the dead-end investment his country had made, forcing him to look at the wreckage of his geopolitical chess piece. This was the exact moment the deep state back home dreaded more than anything else. This was the raw truth that completely blew up their carefully crafted story of American weakness and inevitable decline. The left-wing politicians and their media lapdogs would have you believe that the whole thing was a stalemate. They'd go on Sunday morning TV and smugly declare that the America First agenda had somehow blown up in our faces. But right here was the commander-in-chief, sitting in the heart of Beijing, laying out the undeniable, brutal scorecard of victory. It was a win pulled off not by endless, bloody ground wars, but by overwhelming, targeted economic and military leverage. And the guy sitting across from him knew it. The chairman knew that the proxies he banked on to distract the United States were being systematically taken apart. He knew that the era of American appeasement, the era of saying sorry for simply existing, was dead and gone. The silence crept back onto the balcony, but it wasn't the chairman's weapon anymore. It belonged to the president. He sat there, soaking in the fading light, letting the reality of that fried chicken joke sink deep into the bones of the globalist agenda. He had set the hook. He had destroyed the idea that America's enemies were untouchable, and as the sun finally dipped below the skyline, throwing the courtyards into pitch black, the real fight was just getting started. The president had laid the corpse of the Iranian threat right on the table. Now he was waiting for the chairman to make his next move. He was waiting for the inevitable counterpunch, that desperate play the globalists always tried to pull when they were backed into a corner. He knew the chairman had a card hidden up his sleeve, a card handed to him by a weak, sellout ally in Europe. But what the chairman didn't know, what the deep state didn't know, was that the president had already rigged the deck. The game was on, and the stakes were nothing short of the survival of the free world. The dying sun threw a blood-orange glare across the polished rosewood table, lighting up the dust floating in the suffocating air of the Forbidden City. This was the kind of table where, for decades, globalist politicians had quietly sold out American blue-collar workers over polite cups of tea. They'd show up here, smile for the cameras, read their carefully scripted apologies for American exceptionalism, and sign away our global leverage. But not today. Today, that ancient rosewood table was a chopping block, and the man in the navy blue suit was holding the axe. We are going behind the heavily guarded doors of the 14th of May 2026, straight into the heaviest diplomatic showdown of our lifetime. The mainstream media will never give you the straight story about what happened in that room, because the truth completely breaks their worldview. They've spent years trying to brainwash you into thinking the Iranian regime is this high-tech, terrifying military juggernaut that has to be bought off at any cost. They wanted you scared out of your mind of the mullahs so they could justify sneaking them pallets of untraceable cash in the middle of the night. But sitting across from the head of the Chinese Communist Party, President Trump was about to rip the mask off that lie. He was about to lay out a brutal takedown of a proxy empire that had been absolutely wiped off the map by the America First agenda. The president leaned forward, the leather of his chair creaking a little, a sound that popped like a gunshot in the dead quiet room. You know, Chairman, the experts in Washington love to use fancy words to describe your buddies in Tehran. They talk about asymmetric warfare and regional hegemony. But let me give you a term from Louisiana. A term real, hard-working Americans understand. Right now, both the public and the private sector in Iran are being held together with spit and duct tape. Let that sink in for a second. Spit and duct tape. It's brilliant. It's raw. And it is brutally spot on. The State Department snobs would probably faint if they heard talk like that. But that is exactly why the American people put this man in charge. He slices right through the bureaucratic red tape and hands the ugly truth straight to the people who think they run the world. The chairman's eyes twitched, the tiniest crack in his stone-cold poker face as he processed the sheer disrespect of the comment. He was used to dealing with spineless European leaders who shook in their boots at the thought of offending him. He wasn't used to an American president looking at his multi-billion-dollar Middle Eastern pet project and calling it a junkyard. Spit and duct tape is not an official military term. Mr. President, the chairman finally fired back, his voice a low, calculated hum. No. It's a reality term, the president shot back without missing a beat, not giving him an inch to breathe. Let's look at the numbers, because I know how much you love numbers, Chairman. 7 out of 10 Iranians are out of work. 7 out of 10. That isn't an economy, that's a graveyard. You backed a regime that promised to wipe us off the map, and now they can't even put a loaf of bread on the table for their own people. We bombed their infrastructure back to the Stone Age. We hit the targets that actually mattered, the ones the weak politicians back in my country were always too scared to touch. And what's the payoff? They are drowning in 70% inflation. Think about that for a second. 70% inflation. The mainstream media anchors in New York City whine when their fancy lattes go up by 50 cents, but they wanted to prop up a regime that has bankrupted an entire nation. The Iranian currency is basically monopoly money now, completely crushed by the relentless, suffocating weight of maximum pressure sanctions. And when the people figure out they're starving, while the elites are pocketing their money, the president kept pushing, his voice dropping into a dark whisper. The regime panics. Their internet gets cut. They have to throw their whole country into a digital blackout just to stop the truth from leaking out. A government that has to turn the lights off just to stay alive is not a government you should be putting your chips on, Chairman. The president was tearing down the fake front of the Chinese-Iranian alliance piece by piece. He was putting it out there that Beijing had tied itself to an anchor. But he wasn't done yet. He was about to pivot from the economic bloodbath to the military beatdown. This is the part the Pentagon desk jockeys tried to hide from you. The part the Democrats are praying you ignore. You know better than anyone what we've done on the military side, the president said, spreading his hands flat on the table, because I am 100% sure your intelligence guys watched it happen live. Their launchers? Gone. Those fancy ballistic missiles they love to show off around Tehran? For the most part, totally gone. Their drone factories? Vaporized. The plants that were supposed to crank out the swarm that would overwhelm our defenses are nothing but smoking craters in the sand. The chairman shifted his weight just a hair. A tiny tell that the president was hitting a raw nerve. This wasn't just a hit on Iran. It was a direct hit on the Chinese tech and bankroll that had built that war machine in the first place. And let's talk about their conventional guys, the president said, a grim smile playing on his face. Their navy? Gone. Sent straight to the bottom of the ocean. Their air force? Gone. It is a complete and total military wipeout. This right here is the absolute heart of the whole thing. For years, the left screamed that if we stood up to these thugs, we'd get dragged into a massive, bloody ground war. They told us it was impossible to wreck an enemy's military without tossing away thousands of American lives. But the president proved them dead wrong. He used pinpoint precision. He used overwhelming tech. And he used the sheer, terrifying threat of American grit. He didn't need to put boots on the ground to wipe out their navy. He just needed to give the green light that the last few administrations were too gutless to give. I could get on a plane right now, the president told the chairman, his eyes burning with absolute certainty. I personally could fly anywhere I want across the whole country of Iran right now and feel completely safe. Do you know why? Because they don't have any air defenses left. We took every single one of them out. They are completely naked from the sky. Just imagine the shockwaves rattling around the chairman's head right now. The American president is sitting in his backyard, taunting him with the fact that his prized proxy army is completely stripped of its armor. It's an unheard-of flex of pure dominance. The intel is out there, the president stated, leaning back and crossing his arms. It will take, in my opinion, at least 20 years, and cost a cool $1 trillion before they are even somewhat back to normal. $1 trillion. And I don't have the slightest clue where they're going to scrape together that kind of cash. He let the number just hang there, a massive, unpayable tab resting right on the chairman's shoulders. If they think China is going to front it for them, or if they think Russia has the cash laying around to bail them out, they're in for a very rough wake-up call. They are flat broke. Half of their oil fields are low pressure. Once they shut those pumps off, they are never getting them back on. The blockade is tight. Nothing goes in, and nothing comes out. We hit our mark. We made sure they will never get their hands on a nuke because they don't even have a functioning country left to build one in. This is what the America First doctrine actually looks like out in the wild. It's not about starting wars, it's about shutting them down before they even start, by making the price of crossing us completely unimaginable. The left wants you to feel bad for the regime. The globalists want you to think this level of payback is somehow unfair or overkill. But out in the real world, out where the wolves run, the only thing that actually guarantees peace is completely, undeniably smashing your enemy's ability to do damage. The chairman stared at the president, his poker face finally showing some cracks under the non-stop barrage of facts. He knew everything the American was saying was on the money. The Iranian gamble had blown up. The spit and duct tape empire had caved in under the weight of an American leader who actually loved his country enough to go to bat for it. But the chairman was a survivor, a guy who clawed his way to the top of a cutthroat communist machine. He wasn't going to throw in the towel without playing his last card. He took a slow, deep breath, fixing his cuffs as he got ready to pivot away from the smoking ruins of the Middle East. He was going to try and move the chessboard. He was going to look toward the Indian Ocean, toward a little dot called Diego Garcia, and toward a weak-kneed British Prime Minister named Keir Starmer. The chairman thought he had a secret weapon, a backroom deal that the globalists had handed him on a silver platter. But the deep state's little insurance policy was already dead on arrival. The president had already seen the playbook, and he had already changed the locks. The air in the Forbidden City was getting heavier by the second, not from the sticky Beijing summer heat, but from the crushing, undeniable weight of American dominance. We are watching the commander-in-chief sit right across from the head of the CCP, and he isn't blinking. He just laid out the absolute wreck of the Iranian regime. He just painted a picture of a country held together by spit and duct tape, its military dusted, its economy choking to death under 70% inflation. He proved that America First isn't just a bumper sticker, it's a lethal, razor-sharp tool of global reality. But now, the president is about to switch gears. He's about to pivot from the enemies overseas to the enemies right in our own backyard. Because we all know, and the president definitely knows, that the toughest fights aren't always in the deserts of the Middle East or the waters of the South China Sea. The dirtiest fights happen right in the swamp of Washington, D.C. They are fought against a permanent political class, a deeply dug-in bureaucracy, and a mainstream media machine that acts like the PR department for the globalist elites. He watched the chairman. He watched the slight, almost invisible tightening of the chairman's jaw. The chairman is a guy who lives and dies by optics, by the illusion of looking tough, and the president had just smashed that illusion to pieces. A faint, almost mocking smirk played on the president's lips. He knew exactly what was going through the chairman's head. He knew that the chairman, just like every other dictator on earth, had been glued to CNN, MSNBC, and the pages of the New York Times. They watch our media. They watch our legacy networks to take the temperature of our national guts. And what they see is a pathetic, endless loop of self-hate and fake outrage. You know, Chairman, the president started off, dropping his voice to a casual, almost inside joke tone. I watch the news, just like you do, and I know what my Democratic friends back home are trying to spin. They're running around Capitol Hill. They're sitting in their fancy TV studios, and they're trying to say, we lost. This right here is textbook psychological warfare. The president is grabbing the exact talking points the Chinese Communist Party hopes to use against us, and he's dragging them right out into the daylight. He's calling out the division back home, but he's doing it to show he doesn't care about it at all. He's looking at the chairman and saying, I know you see the cracks, but those cracks are painted on by liars. They are trying to tell the world that our game plan failed. The president went on, locking eyes with the chairman like a laser. They want everyone to buy the idea that holding all the cards is somehow a massive screw-up. But you know they're lying, right? The silence that hit after that was thick enough to cut with a knife. The chairman didn't answer. He couldn't. Agreeing would mean admitting the American media was a total joke, and disagreeing would mean ignoring the smoking ruins of his Iranian pet project. He was boxed in by the president's words. They know exactly what we pulled off, the president said, his voice turning hard, the casual vibe swapped out for cold, righteous anger. They get the exact same classified briefings I do. They see the satellite pictures. They know the strait is locked down. They know the oil fields are going dark. And they know the mullahs are begging for mercy behind closed doors. But they'll never admit it on camera. This is the disease of the deep state. This is the rot eating away at the foundation of our country. We have a political crowd in America that is so eaten up by its own thirst for power, so blinded by its crazy hatred for one guy, that they are willing to torpedo American foreign policy. They hate me more than they love America, the president said plainly. The words echoed off the old tapestries in the Hall of Supreme Harmony. They hate me more than they love America. Let that sink right down into your bones. It's the tragic, undeniable truth about the modern left and their buddies in the media. They'd rather watch the United States get humiliated on the world stage than see Donald J. Trump get a historic win. They'd rather see a state sponsor of terror get their hands on a nuke than admit the America First agenda actually kept the world safe. That is exactly why they hide the fact that Iran is on its knees, the president said, hammering the final nail into the media's coffin. They have to hide it, because if the American people actually woke up and saw what we did, if they saw the real-world results of having a commander-in-chief who doesn't bow down and doesn't apologize, the swamp would be drained by morning. The politicians would be out on the street, and the talking heads would have nothing left to whine about. The chairman slowly reached for his teacup, a totally calculated move to buy himself half a second to process the beatdown. He was watching something his brain just wasn't wired to understand. Where he comes from, the press only exists to cheerlead the government's absolute power. The idea of a domestic media squad actively trying to wreck their own national security just to score cheap political points was a totally Western sickness. But the chairman also realized something else. He realized the guy sitting across from him was completely off the leash. The president wasn't scared of bad press. He wasn't going to water down his style just to get a pat on the back from the Washington Post editorial board. He was operating on a totally different wavelength, dealing only in raw, unfiltered power. Your internal politics are complicated, Mr. President, the chairman finally mumbled, tossing out a vague, empty diplomatic cliché. There's nothing complicated about it, Chairman. The president shot right back. It's actually really simple. They want to throw in the towel, and I refuse to let them. They want to hand over the keys to the castle because it makes them feel smart at their little cocktail parties. But I don't give a damn about their cocktail parties. I care about the real world. And the real world is that the people who bet against the United States are currently flat broke, disarmed, and totally irrelevant. This is the moment of pure clarity. This is the message the globalists are terrified you might actually hear. They want you to think their endless compromises and their garbage deals are the only way to run the world. They want you to think that strong leadership is a hazard. But you know what's really dangerous? Weakness. What's really dangerous is a political class that cares more about getting claps from foreign bureaucrats than they care about keeping their own people safe. The president was sitting in the Forbidden City, calling out the ultimate betrayal. He was showing the chairman that the bickering in America wasn't a sign of a dying empire, but the dying gasps of a desperate political club that was losing control of the narrative. "You see, Chairman," the president said, clasping his hands and resting them on the table, "the people who run the TV networks back home, the people who write those snooty think tank papers, they live in a bubble. They think their words can actually change facts on the ground. They think that if they yell we're losing loud enough, it'll magically come true. But words don't shoot down missiles. Words don't jumpstart dead oil fields. And words sure as hell don't scare me. My Democratic friends can scream into the void all they want. They can hold their little hearings. They can leak their fake stories to their favorite reporters. And they can try to gaslight the world into thinking the sky is falling. But when the dust settles, they still have to wake up in a world that I made safe. They still have to live under the umbrella of security that my team built, whether they have the guts to admit it or not." The chairman stayed quiet. He was a master of the long game, a guy who measured time in decades and centuries, not just the next election cycle. He always banked on the American public having the attention span of a goldfish, and American politicians being too cowardly to stick to their guns. He always figured if he just waited it out, America's internal drama would paralyze its foreign policy. But Donald Trump was ripping up the rulebook right in front of his face. Trump was taking all that internal drama, owning it, making fun of it, and completely stripping it of any strategic value. He was telling Beijing, "Don't mix up the loudmouths in my political opposition with the actual policy of the U.S. government. I am the policy. I'm the one holding the cards, and I'm the one cutting the deals. You let them talk." The president wrapped up, leaning back and giving the chairman a look of bulletproof confidence. "Let them say whatever they want, because at the end of the day, you and I both know what's real. You know Iran is done for. You know the days of America kissing up to people are dead and buried. And you know that the people who hate me more than they love our country don't have the power to stop what's coming next." The shadows in the room were stretching out, the golden hour fading into a heavy, dark twilight. The president had completely wrecked the chairman's Middle East game plan, and he had totally stripped away the fake idea that America was vulnerable. He called out the globalist press for selling us out, and he established pure psychological dominance over the whole room. But the chairman didn't get to run a global superpower by accident. He was bleeding. His playbook was out in the open, but he still had one trick left to play. He still had that little backroom deal in the Indian Ocean. He still had the spineless British government to lean on. He thought he had an ace in the hole, a backdoor way to make the United States look stupid and grab a foothold in a massive strategic hotspot. He was getting ready to pivot to Diego Garcia. He was about to try and use the total cowardice of Prime Minister Keir Starmer to cancel out the strength of the American president. But the chairman didn't have a clue what he was walking into. He had no idea he was stepping right into a bear trap the ultimate dealmaker had set weeks ago. The deep state thought they outsmarted us. The globalists thought they scored a win. But they forgot one massive detail. They forgot who was sitting on the other side of the table. The shadows creeping across the slick rosewood table weren't just from the sun going down. They were the visual proof that the battlefield was shifting. We are still inside the Forbidden City, watching the highest-stakes poker game in modern history play out. The American president just took a wrecking ball to the Chinese chairman's Middle Eastern strategy. He laid out the cold, hard, embarrassing facts about the total meltdown of the Iranian proxy regime. He exposed their spit and duct tape military, and he completely swatted away the frantic America last spin. The left-wing legacy media was pushing back home. The president had the dragon backed into a corner. But here's the thing about cornered dragons: they don't just roll over and play dead. They snap. They look for a soft spot, and if they can't find one in the armor of the American president, they look for one in the weak, rotting underbelly of our so-called allies. They look for the globalists. The chairman sat perfectly still, taking in the brutal reality of what the president just said. His Middle Eastern bankroll was gone. His proxy army had its teeth pulled, and his play to use America's domestic drama as leverage completely tanked. For a split second, the room was so quiet you could hear the old wood of the Hall of Supreme Harmony creaking. And then it happened. A faint, icy smirk started creeping onto the chairman's face. It wasn't a smile because he thought something was funny. It was the cold, calculated smirk of a bureaucrat who thinks he has a secret ace tucked in his sleeve. It was the smile of a guy who thinks he just found the ultimate back door through the American defense perimeter. Let's break down exactly how these global players think. They know they can't beat us in a straight-up fistfight of power, economic muscle, or military hardware. So, what's their move? They game the weaknesses of the international system. They prey on the cowardice of politicians who care more about looking like the good guy at international summits than actually keeping their countries safe. And right now, the chairman was about to cash in on the absolute, mind-blowing incompetence of the British government. He was about to play the Diego Garcia card. Now, if you don't have a map of the Indian Ocean handy, let me break down what Diego Garcia is. It's a tiny, horseshoe-shaped speck in the middle of nowhere. But don't let the size fool you. It is one of the most critical, top-secret, absolutely vital military footprints on planet Earth. It's the tip of the American spear. It's where our heavy bombers take off. It's where our subs park. And it's the anchor that keeps the whole region safe from the CCP's takeover fantasies. Without Diego Garcia, our ability to get things done in that part of the world takes a massive hit. And the British, in their endless progressive wisdom, technically own the Chagos Islands where this base sits. For decades, we ran the show there under an ironclad deal. But then the globalists took the wheel in London. Enter Prime Minister Keir Starmer. Prime Minister Starmer is a guy so thirsty for a pat on the head from the global elites that he decided to just hand the islands away. He decided to give them to a country called Mauritius, a place that, historically speaking, has pretty much zero real connection to the Chagos Islands. But do you know who Mauritius is hooked up with? Do you know who their new BFFs are? Beijing. They are absolute best friends. The chairman knew this. He pulled the strings. He watched the British Prime Minister fold like a cheap lawn chair, and he'd been waiting for this exact moment to rub it right in the American president's face. The chairman slowly reached out and tweaked the cuffs of his dark Mao suit. He looked across the rosewood table, that faint smirk now glued to his face. He thought he was about to deliver a kill shot to the America First agenda. The world is a very large chessboard, Mr. President, the chairman said, his voice dropping into a smooth, talking down to you hum. And while you have been entirely focused on the ashes of the Middle East, it seems the tides have shifted in the Indian Ocean. The president didn't blink. He just stared at the chairman, eyes narrowed, waiting for the punchline he already knew was coming. I am sure you are aware of the recent diplomatic triumphs of your closest ally. The chairman kept going, loving every single syllable. Prime Minister Starmer is a very progressive thinker. He understands that the era of Western colonialism is over, and he understands the importance of returning territory to its rightful owners. Listen to the garbage they spew. They use the buzzwords of social justice. They use the guilt-tripping talk of the radical left to excuse handing over massive military power. They dress up a geopolitical disaster to look like historical fairness, and the worst part is the swamp politicians fall for it every single time. They are so terrified of getting called bad names by the international press that they will literally hand the keys to the castle over to our biggest enemy. Mauritius is a beautiful country, the chairman said, leaning in just a bit, and they are very good friends of ours. We have a deep bilateral relationship. We build their infrastructure, we support their economy, and in return, they offer us a level of cooperation that is unprecedented. The chairman wasn't just talking, he was bragging. He was laying out the exact playbook of how the deep state sells out the free world. He was pointing out that he didn't have to fire a single bullet to hijack one of the most important American military bases on the map. He just had to wait for a weak, left-wing politician in Europe to sign a piece of paper. So you see, Mr. President, the chairman wrapped up, locking eyes with the commander-in-chief. Mr. President, you might win in the Middle East, but in the Indian Ocean, Mr. Starmer has already gifted us the spare key to Diego Garcia. Boom. There it was, the counterpunch. The ultimate trump card the globalists handed to the CCP, wrapped up with a neat little bow. The chairman leaned back, his faint smirk turning into a look of total, arrogant victory. He thought he just won the whole summit. He thought he just proved that American muscle could always be sidestepped by European weakness. He thought he just locked down a permanent parking spot for his Navy right next door to our classified bombers. Just picture the sheer nerve of this moment. Imagine sitting across from the leader of the free world and telling him his own allies just threw him under the bus. The mainstream media would love for you to think this is just how diplomacy goes. They'd tell you we just have to roll with this new reality, that we have to share the sandbox, that we can't be bullies about our military bases. They'd want you to believe Prime Minister Starmer made some noble, high-road choice. But we know what's real. Like the president himself said, there have been some pretty awful deals made by the Brits, especially when it comes to Diego Garcia. It was a garbage deal. It was a deal that would put handcuffs on how our troops could handle threats and how we could use that island. It was a total surrender, and the chairman thought the President of the United States was chained to that surrender. He thought that just because some ink dried on a paper in London, the American military was going to pack its bags, toss over the spare key, and let Beijing set up shop in the Indian Ocean. He thought he was dealing with a standard-issue politician. He thought he was dealing with a guy who cared more about the bureaucratic red tape of the international rules-based order than he cared about keeping the American people safe. The silence settled over the balcony again, but it had a different flavor this time. It was the silence of a trap snapping shut. The chairman thought he was the one pulling the trigger on the trap. He thought he had the American president totally boxed in. But what the chairman completely missed, what the whole globalist club constantly misses, is that Donald J. Trump doesn't play their game. He doesn't swallow bad deals just because some other guy signed them. He doesn't respect treaties that sell out American sovereignty. And he sure as hell doesn't let a weak prime minister in London call the shots on the military posture of the United States of America. The chairman's smirk stuck around, a monument to the cockiness of the global elites. He was waiting for the president to blink. He was waiting for the president to look annoyed, to look beat. He was waiting for the president to start rambling about managing the transition or setting up working groups to talk about security issues. But the president just sat there. He looked at the chairman's smug, happy face. He looked at the guy who thought he just outplayed the greatest dealmaker on the planet. And the president didn't flinch. He didn't scowl. He didn't raise his voice. Instead, a totally different look started washing over the president's face. It wasn't a smile. It was the cold, hard stare of a landlord who's about to kick out a very problem tenant. The chairman had slapped his biggest card on the table. He played the Diego Garcia spare key. But the game wasn't over. In fact, the real masterclass in American power was just about to start, because what the chairman was about to find out, and what the whole world was about to find out, is that having a spare key doesn't mean squat if the locks have already been changed. The Forbidden City was sinking into a deep, bruised purple as the sun finally gave up on the horizon. Up on that balcony, the air didn't just feel cold, it felt electric, like those couple of seconds right before lightning hits the ground. The chairman sat there with that smug, happy grin, thinking he just landed the knockout punch. He really bought into the idea that a weak-kneed globalist politician in London handed him the keys to the castle. He thought that by playing the guilt-ridden conscience of the British establishment, he totally bypassed the American military. He thought he outsmarted the guy in the navy blue suit, but anyone with eyes can see the reality. They can see the chairman was throwing a party for a win that didn't exist. You know, Chairman, I've seen a lot of bad deals in my time. The president finally spoke up, and his voice wasn't dripping with the anger or panic the chairman was waiting for. Instead, it was filled with a dry, mocking amusement that seemed to bounce right off the old stone walls. I've seen people sell their souls just to get their name in the paper, and I've seen politicians give away the farm just to get a pat on the back from the UN. And believe me, like I've said before, there have been some pretty bad deals made by the Brits lately. The president leaned over the rosewood table, locking onto the chairman with a predatory intensity. But what Keir Starmer did with Diego Garcia, that's in a league of its own. That is a Hall of Fame bad deal. He wants to give away the Chagos Islands to Mauritius, a place that has basically zero connection to those islands. Hez doing it because he wants to look progressive and decolonized at his little cocktail parties in London. Hez doing it because he cares more about international PR than he does about the actual security of the Western world. The chairman's smile didn't slip, but his eyes narrowed. The legality of the Chagos Islands is a matter of international law, Mr. President. It is about justice for the displaced and the end of an era of occupation. The president let out a short, sharp bark of a laugh that popped like a gunshot in the twilight. Justice? Law? Don't hand me that scripted garbage, Chairman. We both know what this is really about. Mauritius is good buddies with China, aren't they? I hear there's quite a level of relationship there. As the diplomats like to say, let's be real, you guys are BFFs. You've been pumping cash into their infrastructure, buying up their loyalty, and waiting for a moment exactly like this. You talked the globalists in the UK into believing that giving those islands to Mauritius was the right thing to do. And you did it because you knew exactly what Mauritius would do the second the ink dried on that paper. They would turn right around and hand you the spare key to Diego Garcia. The president paused, letting the chairman's own hustle get read right back to him in plain, brutal English. The chairman's smirk stayed glued on, a monument to his own massive ego. He really thought he won. He thought he was holding the ultimate leverage over the American military's most strategic spot in the Indian Ocean. So Starmer cut a bad deal. The president kept going, his voice dropping into a dangerous, low hum. He cut a deal that puts handcuffs on our troops and how we use that island. He thought he was being a leader by surrendering, and he handed you that spare key. The president reached into his pocket, pulled out a heavy silver coin, and tossed it onto the rosewood table. It spun with a metallic ring, catching the last of the light before slapping flat. But here is the thing you don't get about how I operate, Chairman. I don't accept bad deals. I don't give a damn if they are signed by the King of England, the Prime Minister, or the Pope himself. If a deal screws with American security, that deal is dead on arrival. And as for that spare key you think you're holding, The president leaned in so close, their faces were just inches apart. It only opens the door to nowhere. I knew what Starmer was up to before he even picked up the pen. I've been talking to my guys. I've been talking to the military. And I've been watching your BFFs in Mauritius very closely. The second Starmer signed his name to that surrender, I gave a very simple order. I had every single military lock, every digital gate, and every classified access point on Diego Garcia changed. I didn't ask for permission. I didn't wait for a committee report. I didn't shoot a text to the UN asking if it was cool. I just did it. The chairman's face finally cracked. The poker face didn't totally shatter, but the temperature in his eyes dropped about 40 degrees. The reality was starting to sink in. He spent years buttering up Mauritius, years playing the British left, and millions of dollars in shady backroom deals, all to grab a key that didn't fit the lock anymore. You cannot simply overwrite a sovereign agreement between two other nations, Mr. President, the chairman said, his voice straining to keep its cool. I just did. The president shot back with a shrug. Diego Garcia is a strategic hotspot, and having the ability to operate there for the United States military is critically important. I am not going to let a weak prime minister in London or a puppet in Mauritius dictate where we fly our B-52s or where we park our subs. Starmer can play decolonization all he wants in his own backyard, but he doesn't get to play games with American security. He cut a bad deal, and as far as the United States is concerned, that deal is a footnote in a history book that nobody reads. This is what real leadership actually looks like. This is what happens when you have a president who gets that international norms are just a scam designed to bleed America dry. The left wants you to think we have to play along with every ridiculous treaty and every lopsided deal, even if it means handing our bases over to the CCP. They want you to believe that standing up for our own interests makes us undemocratic or bullies. But they are the massive hypocrites here. They are the ones who claim to care about displaced people while they secretly grease the wheels for a communist regime to expand. They are the ones who preach about the rules while they sit back and watch our enemies break every single one of them. You see, Chairman, this is why my Democratic friends back home hate my guts so much, the president said, his voice ringing with cold, triumphant clarity. They love the bad deal culture. They love the endless meetings where everyone gets a participation trophy and America picks up the check. They are probably on the phone with your people right now, apologizing for me. They are probably telling you that if they can just get back in the driver's seat, they'll give you the real keys. But they aren't in the driver's seat. And they aren't getting that chance again. Because the American people have seen what happens when we stop apologizing. They've seen what happens when we treat our enemies like enemies and treat bad deals like trash. The chairman slowly picked up his teacup, moving like a robot. The spare key was worthless. His leverage was up in smoke, and the guy across from him wasn't just refusing to play the game. He flipped the whole table over and walked away. You are setting a very dangerous precedent, Mr. President, the chairman muttered. No, Chairman, the president said, standing up and towering over the table. I am bringing an old one back. It's called peace through strength. It's called mind your own business if you don't want to end up like Iran. The president looked out over the forbidden city, a massive, dark maze of stone and secrets. I've already shown you what happens to people who try to blackmail us with spit and duct tape empires. I've shown you that I'm not afraid to bomb the infrastructure, blow up the launchers, and leave a regime with 70% inflation and no Wi-Fi. If you think I'm going to let you stroll into Diego Garcia just because Keir Starmer had a bad day at the office, you've got a hell of a lot to learn about the new America. The silence on the balcony was absolute now. The chairman sat in the dark, a shadow fading into the shadows. while the American president stood center stage, completely unbothered. The deep state can keep their garbage deals. The globalists can keep their useless keys. Because as long as we have a leader who knows how to change the locks, the front door to the American empire stays bolted shut. The hypocrites in London and Washington can scream their heads off all they want, but at the end of the day, the only key that matters is the one held by the American people, and we aren't giving it up for anybody. You know, Chairman, the people inside the Washington bubble love to talk about diplomacy like it's some kind of magic trick. The president stood tall, his big frame outlined against the darkening Beijing sky, pacing the balcony with the restless energy of a guy who had already won the war while the other guy was still staring at the map. They think you solve problems with de-escalation and strategic patience. But let me tell you how the sausage actually gets made. It's not made in some committee room or at a fancy gala in Brussels. It's made on the ground, in the mud, and at the bottom of an oil well. It's the sound of a guy who gets that power isn't given to you. It's taken by the guy holding the biggest stick. Right now, the strait is closed. My guys have set up a blockade so tight that a seagull couldn't fly in or out without my say-so. Nothing goes in, and absolutely nothing, especially not the oil you're dying for, goes out. But here is the part your experts probably haven't told you, because they're too busy trying to figure out how to grovel for an apology. Half of Iran's oil fields are low pressure. Do you know what that means in the real world, Chairman? Not the world of 5-year plans and propaganda posters, but the world of basic physics. It means that once those pumps stop, and I've made damn sure they stopped the pressure drops for good. Once you power those fields down, you are not getting them back up. The chairman's hand, still holding the porcelain cup, froze in midair. A statue of a guy realizing his multi-billion-dollar energy security plan was literally vanishing into thin air. It's not like flipping a light switch, Chairman. You can't just flip it back on when you decide you want to play nice. You have to re-drill. You have to rebuild the entire setup from the dirt up. And that brings us to the check that nobody in Tehran or here in Beijing has the cash to cover. My best intel, the real stuff, not the garbage the Democrats leaked to the New York Times, shows a crystal clear picture. It will take at least 20 years and cost a bare minimum of $1 trillion before Iran is even somewhat back to normal. $1 trillion. The president stopped pacing and leaned over the table, his shadow looming over the chairman like a mountain. And I don't have the slightest clue where they're going to get that kind of money. Are you willing to fork that over, Chairman? Are you willing to dump $1 trillion of your people's hard-earned cash into a hole in the desert that I can shut down again with one phone call? Because you need to learn a hard lesson if you think Russia or anyone else is going to step up and bail them out. The spit and duct tape era of their economy is over. They are broke, they are busted, and they are finished. My Democratic friends back home are still trying to spin it like we lost. They're probably writing op-eds right now about how risky this blockade is. They don't get that we hold all the cards, every single one of them. We have the best deal maker in the world sitting in the White House, and if we have to go back to operating as the Department of War, we're ready to do that too. But we won't have to, because you're a practical guy, Chairman. You're not going to throw $1 trillion into a fire pit just to prove a point to a weak British Prime Minister or a bunch of radical mullahs. You know the infrastructure is gone, the launchers are gone, the Navy is gone, and the Air Force is gone. You know that Iran is currently a graveyard of terrible investments. And the reason I'm telling you this right here in your own house is because I want you to understand the price tag of betting against America. The left-wing academics would call this coercive diplomacy. I just call it common sense. Why would I let you use a proxy to blackmail the world when I can just wipe the proxy out of the equation? I never said I wanted regime change. I don't care who's sitting in their palaces. I just care that they don't have the gear or the cash to threaten us ever again. And right now, they don't have a dime. So, here's the reality of how the sausage gets made. We shut down the oil, the pressure dies, the money dries up. The friends of the regime figure out that America First isn't just a campaign slogan. It's an economic death sentence for anyone who tries to get in our way. You can hang on to your spare key to Diego Garcia that Starmer gave you, but while you're trying to figure out which lock it fits, I'm the one who controls the fuel that runs the whole world. Are you ready to talk about a real deal now? Or do you want to keep watching your trillion-dollar investment turn into smoke? The president sat back down, picking up his tea like he hadn't just blown up an entire decade of Chinese foreign policy in 5 minutes. Back in D.C., the swamp is probably having a total meltdown, totally unable to cope with a leader who actually throws American weight around instead of apologizing for it. The sun was totally gone now, and the Forbidden City was wrapped in a cold, unforgiving dark. But on that balcony, the light of American resolve had never shined brighter. The sun was officially out of there, swallowed completely by the heavy, nasty smog that always choked the capital city. The Forbidden City, usually a sprawling flex of ancient imperial glory, was now just a massive pitch-black hole. The only light left on that high balcony was the harsh, artificial glow spilling out from inside the Hall of Supreme Harmony. It threw long, warped shadows across the rosewood table, painting the two guys in stark, dramatic contrast. We are still inside the room, the 14th of May 2026, watching the Commander-in-Chief systematically tear down the globalist world order right to the face of its biggest sugar daddy. For the last hour, we've watched the president shred the chairman's proxy empire in the Middle East. We've watched him call out the pathetic, sell-out spare key deal cooked up by the progressive cowards in London. But now, the president is about to deliver the final philosophical kill shot to the entire narrative of the legacy media. For years, the talking heads on CNN, the cocktail party diplomats, and the swamp creatures in Washington have been pushing one massive, coordinated lie about the America First agenda. They've looked right into the camera and told you that putting your own country first means you want to lock America away from the rest of the world. They've called it isolationism. They've called it xenophobia. They've tried to claim that by refusing to get ripped off, the president is somehow abandoning our allies and leaving the world in the dark. They say these things because they are terrified of a world where they can't launder your tax dollars through foreign capitals and endless, unwinnable wars. But sitting across from the chairman, soaking in the harsh, no BS light of the doorway, the president was about to set the record straight, once and for all. He leaned back in his chair, totally relaxed, a guy who had already won the chess match and was now just explaining the rules to the loser. You know, Chairman, the press back in my country loves to write fiction about me. They sit in their studios in New York, and they tell the public that because I'm tearing up these terrible, one-sided deals, I must want America to hide behind a giant wall. They tell you I want to walk away from the world. They feed your state media the exact same line, and I know your analysts swallow it whole. They think that because I won't let you stroll into Diego Garcia, I'm cutting ties with the British. The president shook his head slowly, a gesture of pure pity for how stupid the political class really was. But they are completely wrong. And honestly, I think they know they're wrong, but they just can't stomach the fact that my way actually works. Let me make something crystal clear to you, Chairman, because I know you're mapping out your next 10 years of foreign policy based on this exact chat. America First does not have to mean America alone. Let that sink in. America First does not have to mean America alone. It is a devastatingly simple idea, yet it completely fries the circuits of every Ivy League foreign policy snob in the State Department. The left thinks the only way to have allies is to buy them. The left thinks the only way to keep friends on the global stage is to let other countries treat the U.S. Treasury like their own personal ATM. They think leadership means saying sorry, bowing down, and paying the defense tabs for rich European countries who talk trash about us behind our backs. But the president gets what real alliances look like. We need all the friends we can get. I want friends. I want strong, capable partners. But here's the difference between my team and the weak politicians who came before me. They need to pull their own weight. They need to pay their own bills. The president leaned forward again, tapping his index finger on the table to drive home the absolute finality of what he was saying. The days of the American taxpayer footing the bill to defend the entire free world while those same countries slap tariffs on our stuff are over. The more friends we have, the better. But they are going to be real friends, not freeloaders. They aren't going to be like your buddies in Tehran, scraping by on spit and duct tape and your bank accounts. And they aren't going to be like the current crew in London, trying to give away strategic assets because they don't have the guts to hold on to them. The chairman stayed completely quiet, his hands folded neatly in his lap. He was listening to the funeral march for the grand strategy he built his entire political life around. The chairman had been running on the assumption that the Western Alliance was this fragile, bloated system held together by nothing but American guilt and American cash. He figured if he just pressed hard enough or threw enough bribe money around, those alliances would crack. He looked at places like Mauritius and saw how easy it was to buy a strategic foothold with a checkbook. But now, he was waking up to the fact that the guy sitting across from him was building a totally new kind of Western alliance. An alliance built on mutual respect, actual muscle, and paying your own way. An alliance where the United States was the undisputed boss, not the undisputed sugar daddy. You see, Chairman, you roll with a very different philosophy. You buy up vassal states. You build them a port, you build them a highway, you trap them in debt, and then you own them. You think that's what power is? But what happens when the cash stops flowing? What happens when your economy pumps the brakes, and you can't afford to prop up the radical mullahs or buy off the politicians in the Indian Ocean? Your whole house of cards collapses. My system? My system forces our partners to stand on their own 2 feet, and when they stand on their own 2 feet, the entire free world turns into a fortress that you can never, ever break into. This is the genius of the America First doctrine. It's the ultimate twist that the legacy media refuses to admit. By demanding that our allies pay their fair share, by demanding that they step up their own military game, the president is actually making the alliance tougher. He's trimming the fat, the laziness, and the weakness that the CCP has been feeding on for decades. He's forcing the free world to wake up and realize that the era of the American free ride is permanently closed for business. The people pulling the strings in Washington hate this. They hate it because it yanks the power right out of their hands. They can't broker their shady little backroom deals if everything is out in the open and everyone is paying their own tab. But the American people? The American people love it, because they are the ones who have been picking up the check for this globalist country club for the last 50 years. The president adjusted his cuffs, a casual move that signaled the negotiation was over. There was nothing left to argue about. The facts were laid out. The leverage was locked in, and the geopolitical reality had been violently yanked back into America's favor. We hold all the cards. We have the leverage, we have the economy, and we have the military. And more importantly, the world has finally woken up to the fact that they are dealing with a totally different kind of boss. They know the era of the weak, sellout American politician is dead. The world needs a deal maker right now, Chairman, because the alternative is a total mess. The alternative is a world run by radical regimes and communist dictatorships, and I am not going to let that happen. We've got the best dealmaker in the world, and he is sitting right here in this chair. The president didn't say it to brag. He said it with the cold, hard certainty of a guy reading a bank statement. It was a straight-up fact, backed by the smoking ruins of the Iranian proxy army and the freshly changed locks on the gates of Diego Garcia. He was the best deal-maker in the world, not because he was the nicest guy in the room, but because he was the only one willing to walk away from a garbage deal. He was the only one willing to look the chairman dead in the eye and tell him his trillion-dollar investments were totally worthless. The chairman finally let out a slow, controlled breath that barely moved the air in the room. He had invited the American president to the Forbidden City, expecting to call the shots. He expected to play off the internal political drama of the United States. He expected to slap the spare key of Diego Garcia down as the ultimate trump card. Instead, he just got taken to school in a masterclass of raw, unapologetic American dominance. You are a very tough man to negotiate with, Mr. President. The chairman's voice was quiet, totally stripped of that condescending edge it had just an hour ago. I am only tough if you are trying to rip off my country. The president fired back instantly. If you want to play fair, if you want to respect our sovereignty and the sovereignty of our real allies, we can do incredible things together. But if you try to sneak in through the back door, if you try to use weak politicians in Europe or religious fanatics in the Middle East to undercut us, the president let the sentence trail off, letting the dead silence of the dark courtyard below finish the thought for him. The message was loud and clear. The America First doctrine was not a bluff. It was a promise. America First does not have to mean America alone, but it absolutely means America leads, and everyone else gets in line, or they get left behind in the dust. The president pushed his chair back, the loud scraping noise echoing off the ancient stone floor. The meeting was done. The globalist narrative was shattered. The deep state's insurance policies were canceled, and the true muscle of the American Republic had been fully put back on the map. The left will tell you that this kind of diplomacy is dangerous. They will tell you that talking straight to dictators is a threat to global stability. But they are the ones who made the world dangerous in the first place, by projecting nothing but weakness. True stability only comes from strength. True peace only happens when your enemies know, without a shadow of a doubt, that you are the baddest deal-maker in the room, and that you hold absolutely every single card in the deck. We are going to look at the fallout. We are going to see what happens when the president walks out of that room, leaving the chairman sitting all alone in the dark. We are going to answer the final burning questions about the future of this great nation. The truth is finally out there. Stick around, do not touch that dial, and stay tuned, patriots.